Merhabalar.
Günaydın, nasılsınız?
İyiyim, teşekkürler. Nasılsınız? Siz nasılsınız?
Teşekkür ederim, ben de iyiyim.
Merhabalar.
Merhaba Eren Bey.
Nasılsınız? Neslihan Hanım merhaba.
Merhaba, günaydın, nasılsın Eren?
Günaydın. İyiyim, teşekkürler. Sizden ne haber?
İyi.
Nasıl gidiyor her şey? Yolunda mı? Korona günlerinde.
Fena değil. Garip. Daha çok.
Eren Bey, tanışmamıştık biz daha önce. Ben
Evet, aynen.
ODTÜ Mimarlık bölümünden öğretim
Hı hı.
üyesi. Sizin lisans neredendi?
Ben İTÜ'lüyüm.
İTÜ'densiniz değil mi?
İstanbul Teknik Üniversitesi'nden mezun oldum. Sonra Yale'da master yaptım.
Hangi
Ee,
yıllarda Amerika'daydınız?
2003-2006 arası.
Ay geç, ben de tam o zaman oradaydım.
Yale'da değil ama.
Ben Carnegie Mellon'daydım.
Carnegie Mellon'da.
Evet.
İşte oradan sonra da Londra'ya taşındım. Bir 6 sene daha da çalıştım. Sonra buraya
Ben de
döndüm.
2006'da Londra'ya, Reading'e geçtim. Ben de orada
Bu bayağı paralel seyretmişiz
Evet,
aslında.
evet. Ben de 4 sene, 5 sene Reading'de çalıştım.
Hı
Yani
hı.
Amerika'dan sonra. Ondan önce Reading'deydim 2001-2002 yıllarında.
Festivali meşhurdur Reading'in. Bir türlü şey yapamadım
Evet,
ama
evet,
gidemedim oraya ama.
evet. İşte sonra 2011 gibi döndük. Bizim de
Hı
şeyimiz o.
hı.
2010 gibi Türkiye'ye döndük. Neslihan Hanım, sizinle
Bayağı
tanışmak.
aynı rotayı takip etmişiz.
Evet, doğru. Evet.
Evet, merhaba, ben de eğitim mezunuyum.
Ne güzel.
Burada o zaman. İşte ne denir ona, bir net iletişimdenim. Beton
Aha.
Art ve Ardımento dergilerinin yayıncısıyız bildiğiniz gibi. İşte öyle işlerle uğraşıyoruz.
Güzel, çok güzel.
Tanışmamıştık daha önce, memnun oldum ben de.
Evet, yani.
Hı hı.
Bu şimdi yapacağımız yayının dersin son şeyi olduğunu, haftası olduğunu size hani şimdiden söyleyeyim bu arada. Bu bizim mimarlık bölümünde 8 sene önce başladığımız bir, evet 8. senesi bu sene. Digital Media diye bir dersimiz var. 2 dönemlik bir ders. İlk dönem modelleme kavramları üzerine işte Rhino ve Generative Design, işte Grasshopper falan gibi araçlar öğreniyorlar. İkinci sınıf öğrencileri ilk dönemde. İkinci dönemde BIM kavramlarını ben anlatıyorum. İşte temel kavramları öğreniyorlar. Uygulamalı araçlar üzerinde işte Revit, ArchiCAD, sonra yine başka araçlara atma, hani dosyaları indirme falan o tür şeyleri öğreniyorlar. İşte süreçleri öğreniyorlar, analizler falan. Geçen hafta ben son dersi vermiştim, verecektim. Sonra sizin davet gelince, dedim, müthiş, bu o zaman bizim son dersimiz olur. Hem de pratikte bunları uygulayan birisinden güzelce iyi fikirler alır öğrenciler. Çünkü o tabii teorik olarak bazı kavramları öğrenmeleri bir şey, ama pratikteki bir uygulamacının deneyimlerini dinlemeleri başka bir şey. O açıdan bizim için önemli. Teşekkür ederiz hepinize.
Bahsedeceğim şeylerin bir kısmı aslında çok eski. Yani Londra'da işte 2006-2007 o zamanlarda yaptığım şeylerden de bahsedeceğim biraz. Ama yani bunların bir kısmı bugün belki BIM programları üzerinden daha otomatize hale getirildi. Ama yani görünce zaten bence daha açık olacak. Ya bugün için hala bir kısmının geçerli bir tarafı var. Yani herhangi bir yazılımı açıp, yani kaputunu açıp içinde istediğimiz gibi hani iş yapabiliyor olabileceğimizi hani bilmek önemli diye düşünüyorum.
Evet. 95 kişi olduk. Aslında başlayabiliriz herhalde yavaş yavaş, değil mi? Başlayalım. Evet.
Okay.
So let's start officially with our English language today. Okay. So good morning, everyone, and welcome to this webinar. I'm welcoming you on behalf of Binat İletişim. As I was telling Mr. Koray Pekericli a little bit earlier, Binat İletişim is the publisher of two architectural journals. One of them is the quarterly Betonart, and the other one is the bi-monthly Arredamento Mimarlık. And since 2017, in collaboration with VitrA, we are having these campus visits. We are visiting universities, architectural faculties, and with our guest lecturers and giving them extracurricular lectures like this one. Actually, of course, we were, before this Corona days, we were always doing it face-to-face. We were actually visiting the campuses and having our QAs with the students. But since the end of March, I guess, we have moved our lectures to online platforms like this one. And since 2017, I would like to say that we have visited 31 universities all around Turkey, and we have met with more than 4,700 students so far. Today, we would like to thank Jana Bilsel and Mehmet Koray Pekericli for having us here as guests in their lectures. And Eren Çırıcı will be our speaker, sharing his experiences and views today. Before we start with that, we have VitrA has prepared a little 3-minute video for you to watch, so we are going to have it now. Sinem, videoyu başlatabiliriz. a little bit of wake-up music from VitrA. We thank them for supporting our activity today again. I also would like to remind you that before we start, VitrA has its products technical drawings on the BIM object platform. And also, in collaboration with VitrA, we have published the BIM dictionary. It's a 3-volume dictionary, and it will be given as gifts to our participants today. So, Eren.
Hi everyone. Before I start, I'd quickly like to thank Mehmet Koray Pekeçli for inviting us to his class, to METÜ today, and to Neslihan Şık, the whole Binat family, and VitrA for organizing this platform. I think it's great that we can all share our experiences on architecture given the current situation, the corona situation all over the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Now I'll share my screen and start, if that's fine. Can you all see my screen? Okay, good. All right. Discipline and profession. This is the title of this lecture. These two concepts are crucial to understand the relationship of technology to architecture. According to Oxford Dictionary, discipline basically means an area of knowledge, a subject that people study or are taught, especially in a university. Sociology, philosophy, painting, law are examples of different disciplines. Architecture, too, is a discipline that produces its own autonomous body of knowledge. What is profession then? According to Oxford Dictionary, profession is a type of job that needs special training or skill, especially one that needs a high level of education. According to these definitions, the profession can be thought of as disciplinary knowledge made useful to other people. In the case of architecture, this relationship is a bit more complicated. Architectural disciplinary knowledge is not limited to practical knowledge that concerns how to build a building. Architectural profession, on the other hand, is not a closed loop that doesn't feed back into the discipline of architecture. Here, we're looking at a 16th century copy of Vitruvius's book, De Architectura, or the 10 books on architecture, as it has been translated into English. The book is believed to be written between 30 and 15 BC. It's a book that has been relevant throughout the history of architecture and is still relevant today. The way we build has radically changed over the last 2 millennia, but the ideas in this book regarding functionality, beauty, and strength remain relevant. It's precisely because of this fact that when we talk about digital architecture, for example, we can go back and look at Borromini's San Carlino and the way he used curvilinear geometry to construct space. Or, in this age of digital design, we can go back and look at Venturi's work, in this case, the Bonaventure house, to try to understand his concept of the difficult whole, which today is as relevant as it was almost 60 years ago. And sometimes we never look back. I found this photo on a website called Vintage Everyday. Unfortunately, there was no information on where it was taken and by whom. But it's fair to say that until about 40 years ago or so, all architecture offices looked pretty much like this. Without a doubt, computers have changed the way architects operate professionally. In the period of transition to computers, there were debates about the many pros and cons of using computer-aided design tools. Some people argue that there is no scale to drawing on a computer screen, that you can zoom in and out as you like. They believed that drawing to scale was crucial to architecture and preferred hand drawings. When I was doing my master's at Yale University in the early 2000s, in his formal analysis class, Peter Eisenman told us that on the computer, to draw a line, you basically place dots on the screen, which he thought wasn't the same thing as drawing a line on paper. In his class, we produced hand drawings. He still teaches the same course, and I wouldn't be surprised if still the students draw by hand. But in the end, much was debated about the use of technology in architecture offices, how we operate, and the computers won. Architecture offices look much different today than they did 40 years ago. How does an architecture office look today, and what does it aspire to be? Okay, here we're looking at a parametric model of a Porsche. This is where we're trying to get at professionally. In the automobile industry, clay models and hand sketches are still an integral part of the initial stages of the design process. However, as design stages progress, all design and technical aspects of the car are coordinated with a parametric software that enables many people to work on the design at the same time. Architecture is different than automotive or aviation industries, therefore it wouldn't be fair to make a comparison and say we're behind, but we're definitely going in their direction. And please be reminded that architecture has a long time fascination with cars and transatlantics, starting with modernism, but that fascination was more about the aesthetics of functionality, and it has never really translated into how we operate professionally up until very recently. Having briefly talked about some basic concepts about architectural knowledge and professional practice, I'll try to talk more about how technology relates to these concepts with some projects I have worked on over the years. This is one of the first projects I worked on at Hadid Architect. It's called the Signature Towers. The project was at the center of the financial district in Dubai and comprised 3 towers, the tallest being the office, the one in the middle is a business hotel, and the shortest one that the hotel is leaning onto is a residential tower. They're all connected at the base by a podium. I joined the office in 2006, and this was a competition the office had just won, and I joined the team to get it built. In the meantime, the office sent me to a 3-day generative components workshop at the Architectural Association to learn the basics of the software. GC, as it was called, is the first parametric modeling software for architects. It unfortunately doesn't really exist anymore, and even back then it wasn't a commercial product, it only had a beta release. There was no guidebook or anything. So after the workshop, as I was trying to learn more about it, I just looked at stuff people were posting in online GC forums. I eventually learned how to script in GC, as the software's regular functions were insufficient to model certain things. Then we started testing and using it in the office for the Signature Towers. The very first thing we did, even before utilizing GC, was to rationalize the geometry, because the competition 3D model was built using freeform curves. You might know them as NURBs as well. To rationalize the geometry means redrawing the freeform curves using simple geometry like lines and arcs. Lines and arcs can be used to create flat and single curved surfaces like cylinders, which are much cheaper to build than double curved surfaces built with freeform curves. The aim is to simplify the geometry to the point where it still looks like the original and it still looks good, but it's much more economical to build. The next thing we did was to parametricize the lines and arcs that created the shapes of the towers. Here, each line and arc is defined by its dimensions, rotation, and location in relation to the other lines and arcs. What this does is that if you want to change the geometry of the building, you change the parameters instead of remodeling the whole building. We did this first for the volumes of the towers, and then we did it for all the facade elements, all the facade strips that you can see in this slide. The next thing was to build the GC model, where the whole facade is defined by parametric relationships. Every point and line is defined by a mathematical formula. Here on the screen, you can see that there's a mathematical formula for almost every line. And if you move something, the rest of the geometry updates with that change you just made. So this is what it does, basically. These are some variations of the geometry. It would take a very long time to model all of them. With the GC model, it takes minutes to create all these different variations. It takes a long time to reconstruct the geometry as a set of parametric relationships and build the 3D model, but once you have it, it makes life so much easier. You don't want to invest time in a parametric model in the very beginning of a project where you're still sketching and testing different ideas. But once you get to the next stage where you know what the design is, then it's very useful. In this project, we had to deal with a very complex program, hundreds of different size hotel rooms and residential units. And on top of that, we had to figure out the structure. All this meant that we had to make small adjustments to the geometry all the time. So this type of parametric tool makes it really easy to make those small adjustments. When you look at the key plans of the hotel tower, the complexity of the design becomes even more evident. The top left drawing shows a plan at the lower levels. As you go up, the core of the building stays where it is, obviously, and the floor plate moves across, which means the relationship of the core to the floor plate changes on every level. Drawing these plans was another problem because unlike straight towers where floor plans don't change drastically, here every floor plan was unique and had to be drawn. By this time of the project, we realized that cutting sections from the 3D model, exporting them as 2D geometry, and creating individual drawings for each plan, every time we had to adjust the geometry of the tower was just crazy. And to remind you, we had to adjust the geometry quite a lot. So what we did was, me and one of my teammates, we decided that we should just write a script that does all of this for us. We didn't know a single thing about scripting in Visual Basic, leave aside the particulars of how that worked in the software we used, but we decided to go ahead anyway. We had the office buy a Visual Basic book for us, and in about 1 week, we wrote a script that cut floor plans from the 3D model and saved each one in a separate file with all the layers named correctly after structure, walls, facade cladding, etc. We took another week to develop a user interface so that the rest of the team could use it. Along the way, we wrote another script that calculated gross floor area, usable area, and circulation area in every floor and put that information in an Excel sheet. These tools that we created are very useful for professional practice, realizing an idea, but not necessarily relevant for shaping design ideas. You can use these tools regardless of what the design is. They're geared towards making life easier, but they're still important for design because when you start a new project, you know that the complexity of the design wouldn't be a problem down the road. This next project is a decade-old design research project where I developed a tool for achieving complexity with modularity. I wrote a script that helps a base surface derive the extrusion distance of a module in real time. The tool allows for a great deal of architectural variation from pixelation to gradient parametric change, depending on how you manipulate the base surface. Another idea behind this project was to bridge the gap between scripting and modeling. With scripting, you run the script, and depending on how complex the task is, you sit and wait for results. It can be a few minutes or it can be an hour. If you don't like the result, you make changes to your script and run it again, but you can't control the script in real time. With this tool, I was able to see the changes to the modules as I was manipulating the surface. This is a quick video showing how that works. As you manipulate the surface, the modules behind it move. Architecture can't be reduced to a set of parameters, though. It's more complicated than that. It's more of a negotiation between competing requirements, needs, and desires than a puzzle that can be solved mathematically. Therefore, a script and its parameters will rarely give you a satisfying result. You will always want to be able to tweak it in real time, if you can. At some point, Medyada, my wife, who is also my partner at work, and I decided to move to Istanbul and start our architecture and design office. Medyada was working for Grove in London, and therefore we were very familiar with what each of us was doing, regardless of the fact that I was doing architecture and she was doing design. So starting something together seemed very reasonable. We started Fields, and this is one of the first projects we did in Istanbul. It was a small invited competition for adaptive reuse of an existing building by a bank. I guess it's obvious which one it is. We teamed up with an interior design firm. They designed the interiors and we designed the facade. The brief was not to touch the facade on the ground level, which would be used as the branch level, as they wanted to put their corporate identity graphics on the facade. On the upper levels, the brief was to wrap the building with a new skin so as to hide the existing and not so interesting facade. What we did was we took the bank's logo, abstracted it, and started deforming its geometry so that it would act like a diaphragm. Depending on what was behind the facade, a meeting room or an office that needs light, or an archive that doesn't need light, the diaphragm would open and close to let light in or not. The geometry was controlled in a very similar way to the previous research project I showed. Aperture of each component is controlled by its distance to a deriving surface. And here you see it in perspective. This is also one of our early projects in this. It's a penthouse in the Oldu Center. It's split on 2 levels for a young couple who wanted to live downstairs and use upstairs as a home office. Here we're looking at the living area and the wall behind the dining table. We had this discussion with our clients as to what we should do with that wall, whether we should hang art or not, and we suggested designing a wall installation. We wanted to animate the wall with phenomenal movement and play of light. The pattern is somewhat like an interference pattern formed on the surface of the water when multiple ripples start intersecting with each other. Here we're looking at how the topology of the resulting surface is formed. On the left, you see the thicker main curves that control the thinner curves formed by lofting the main curves. In the middle is the same thing with curvature, with the curve directions mirrored. And on the right side, you see the intersection of the 2 sets of curves. To give these curves depth, we wrote a simple script that takes the circumference of each cell and uses that number to give the cells depth. You're looking at a small portion of the installation that was built as a prototype. How the depth changes across the wall is clearly seen in these photos in the section of the prototype. Since each cell's shape is unique, you get this varying depth effect, which translates to a play of light and shadow under different light conditions. The wall was manufactured from a 3D model in several parts using a CNC mill and assembled and painted on site. Digital fabrication ensures that the real wall is an exact copy of the computer model. Finally, I'm going to talk about a competition project we did about 4 years ago. In the beginning of the lecture, I talked about architecture's fascination with cars and transatlantics. Now I'm going to talk about warships from World War I, but in a different context. This is also about how we started steering our office to a different direction in terms of the ideas that we were interested in. Although architecture has been very much involved with technology over the last 30 years or so, architecture has never been solely about exploring the potential of digital technologies. Starting from the early 90s, digital design tools have been instrumental to exploring architectural ideas, but they have never been the aim itself. At the time, architectural theory was shaped by Deleuzian concepts about smoothness, pliability, and continuity. The 3D modeling software helped to realize the forms suggested by these ideas. The projects I have talked about so far fall mainly in this domain. It's been a long time since the 90s. Some of the formal gestures of digital design are tired by now, and the world has changed. We no longer live in a world where the end of history was announced, the Soviets fell apart, the Berlin Wall was torn down, and globalization was working at full speed. Now, back to the ship. The pattern you see on this ship was frequently used on warships as camouflage during World War I. The pattern helps to make the form of the ship illegible, which makes it harder for other ships to identify it as an enemy ship. It also makes it more difficult to identify direction of the ship, making it harder to target it with torpedoes. As the ship hides in plain sight, we know it's a ship, but we can't grasp and understand its qualities fully. This resonated with some of Graham Harman's writings I got interested in at the time. A proponent of object-oriented ontology, Harman argues that we can never fully know things and that objects will always withdraw themselves from us. Our understanding of other objects are limited to our own perspective. He gives an example from medieval Islam philosophy. The only thing fire knows about cotton is that it burns. He argues that most of Western thought has been about trying to explain the world by science, physical characteristics of objects, or by humanities, the network of relations an object is embedded in. In the context of architecture, parametric design was all about establishing a network of relations, and Harman's ideas looked very different and fresh. Çaycuma Science Center competition was a good opportunity to play with these ideas. I enjoy science centers a lot, and I think they're a great place, especially for young people to learn about and enjoy science. If there's one positive outcome of the coronavirus situation that we're in, it made it very clear how badly we depend on science. On the other hand, there's more to the human experience than science can explain. Therefore, we wanted the Science Center to be an architectural experience on the limits of human understanding. The very first thing we did was to assign a different volume to all major parts of the program, by which we tried to avoid a unitary reading of the building. When we started grouping the program volumes, we tried to avoid any kind of directionality so that there is no front or back. At the same time, we wanted all volumes to share a similar architectural language so that in the resulting massing, none of them stood out as a recognizable object. In response to Zonguldak's industrial heritage, we used the repeating gable and sawtooth roofs, but rotated them at an angle to the axes of each volume to further dissolve directionality and to create unexpected forms from familiar simple forms. And these are some other views. It was quite straightforward. There were lots of trees on the site, and to avoid cutting them, we placed the building on the foundations of a once existing technical building. This was useful for the architectural strategy as well. The approach to the building from the main road became an experience in itself, as people would walk on a broken line, getting closer to the thing. That doesn't quite make a lot of sense. Here we see the building in plan. Here is the main entrance, and this is the main foyer of the building, where all other spaces, including the exhibitions, the cafe, the lecture hall, and the administrative part from the foyer. The roofs are visible from inside, creating a continuous yet different spatial experience across the building. Here on the right-hand side, you see the exhibition halls. The sawtooth roof helps to get light in the exhibitions. It's indirect light. The volumes are facing north. The massing kind of looks arbitrary, but actually it follows the pattern of the sun as well, so that there's always this like uniform light in the exhibition halls, and there's never direct sunlight coming in. And with the administration here on the left-hand side, you can see that the repeating roof provides continuity across the whole space. And the section of the building almost blends in with the rest of the building in elevation. And finally, for the representation, we didn't make photorealistic renderings. That would be counter to the ideas we were playing with about objects and reality. Instead, we used a more graphic representation technique. This image is clearly generated using software, but it's not about all the advanced tricks software is capable of doing. Thank you very much for listening. If you have any questions, I'd be more than happy to answer them, or if you have any comments to make. I'll just stop sharing my screen. Are you still there?
Thank you very much, Veren. This was
You're welcome.
Very interesting and inspirational. I'd like to ask my students, do you have any questions there? Let me see the participants, attendees. You can ask questions through the chat if you wish. Maybe I should ask one question first.
Sure.
So when you moved back to Turkey, and when you started practicing here, what were the challenges that you came across when you consider the digital tools or the attitude of the client towards the implementation of such methods?
Well, the two experiences are a bit different. I mean, at Zaha, it was a very big office, corporate environment, and very big clients. And the way you implement technology in an environment like that is different than what you do in your own office when you just start up and you're only two people. And it's a different set of clients. But I think, especially with the Zorlu Center project, we were quite lucky because we designed the whole house. But with this wall installation thing, we told them that we would model it in computer software and get it CNC milled, and they were okay with it. They didn't think we were just proposing this crazy thing and that we would never be able to make it, and it would be a waste of time and resources. Maybe that also has to do with them being computer engineers, that they believe in this kind of stuff, but we had their full confidence, and they were in the end very happy with the results.
When you showed us this facade where you had this the short video where the geometry, the cubes were basically fitting the curvature of the facade, I just remembered something. Sometimes when you design things with these tools, the on-site implementation becomes a big issue because of the way materials come together and tolerances that we need for them to match each other. How do you resolve these problems, or do you envision such problems to that you can come across and design accordingly? How do you match the manufacturing and the design tasks?
Well, I guess it depends on the scale of the thing you're making. With the bank project, it's kind of simple because it's an outfit, for example, to talk about that one. it would be a very simple thing because it's an outer skin. It's a small building, so there wouldn't be many technical issues. But if you say, I want to do something like that for a big building, which also has to perform functionally, it has to keep the cold weather and water out, then it becomes a much more complicated problem. And in my personal experience at Zaha, we always had facade engineers working on the projects, consultants from outside the office, people who not only were very knowledgeable in the field of parametric design, but at the same time they knew how to build things. So they would be telling us things like, the tolerance needs to be this much. This is the kind of profile we need to use. We need to take into account, extension. So we have to, create this type of detail. And it's, a consultancy. It's a science on its own. Yeah. So I think to tackle, much larger projects, you definitely need someone who knows how to build these things professionally. I think an architect on his own wouldn't be able to do these things for larger projects. With smaller projects, obviously, if it's an installation or or just a simple facade treatment for a small building, I think it's much easier.
In that regard, I remember one project of Zaha. I think it was in Azerbaijan, and a company from Ankara who are specialists in furniture and let's say, I think, indoor design. Sunset Eco, it was Melik Gün. So they were involved in that project, and I remember very well how they had to work hard to satisfy the needs of the architect. In that regard, I have one question. When such relationships happen, do you also transfer the parametric rules and design, let's say, tools that you are using to these people? Like, like all the formulas and things, like how do you do it? Or is it just a 3D geometry that you are handing over?
The company you named, I didn't work on that project myself, but a good friend of mine worked on it. She did the whole interior, and she was saying that this firm in Ankara, they were really good, but they didn't really have the tools to tackle this problem. But in the process, they learned about it.
They were quite impressed with the project.
Yeah, and they were finally able to pull it off. But I think it's a bet. You're taking a risk if you're working with a company that doesn't really, haven't used these tools before, which also happened. I've heard about this for a project in Russia, that the contractors and the engineers weren't really familiar with these tools and the way these things are designed, and they had to be replaced basically. So that different.
So your expectation in such a project as a designer, your expectation from the contractor or the final builder or installer is to be able to understand how these things are designed and they work, and so that they can do minor adjustments to fit the final result, right?
Yeah, definitely.
In that regard, of course, there will be changes that can be expected from the end result, right? So are there any limits as a designer that you can, let's say, put into place? For instance, you can say, okay, I can only allow like 5 centimeters shift to there, or like this much of tolerance change.
Yes, of course. I think that's the way it has to happen.
Yeah.
And I think when you work with people who operate at that level, engineers and fabricators, they already know who you are. I mean, in the sense that you're an architect and there are certain things that you're after, and they see themselves successful if they can, somehow make your idea real. They're not really after, okay, this is how it can be done, and your idea is bad, and I'm going to, build it this way because this is how it's done. They take it as a challenge on themselves to make sure that they, realize your idea. I think it's a fundamental view on how you see these things.
Yeah. Good point. Students are not asking questions, but I'll keep on asking on behalf of them. So these students, they learned a lot of basic concepts. Students are very eager on improving themselves in that area. And they learned how to model in 3D using Rhinoceros, for instance, and some other tools. They can do some basic, let's say, solutions using Grasshopper. And this semester they dwelt on BIM tools and how BIM changes the whole, let's say, construction process. So my question to you is, we're about the same age with you, and you followed one track and I followed another track, and now it's great to have you here because following the track that you have done so, what would you suggest students to take on from today? These are second year, third year, fourth year architecture students to be valid in the future like you are today, because you achieved something that needs to be achieved for 21st century, and you are, let's say, one of few people who can do things and understand them in that realm. So what would you suggest students to focus on for the future? So what do you think because we cannot expect BIM to continue forever, there will be some other things to come on, and what do you suggest them to take on?
Yeah, I mean, I think the GC example is a good example. It was the thing, when I was in London, everyone thought it would be the future of parametric design. What ended up happening was that there was never a commercial release. Robert Aish, who was running the project, who was the director at Bentley, left Bentley, moved to Autodesk, and then Revit took off. And in the meantime, the people at Rhino, they used to come to Zaha a lot, by the way, the Rhino people. And I can't remember his name now, Chris Rotten or something, like a rock star name. The guy who wrote Grasshopper, he was very much at Zaha, and he would discuss with people at Zaha what they wanted, how they were using scripts and stuff. And he saw GC as well, I guess. And he thought, okay, I'll just write this new software for, parametric design. And we just saw it happening in real time. He would just bring beta releases and say, this is what I'm working on right now. How do you think this is? But then, software evolves. So you just have to, understand the basics of it, I think. If you know the basics of scripting, which would be understanding logical loops, for each statements, that kind of thing, then you can always, adapt yourself to new technologies, because there's a certain logical operation under all of these tools. And if you really want to learn something new, it becomes easier if you know the basic stuff. But at the same time, I wouldn't really, make my career as an architect depend on technology, because, technology gets dated. What you do today, which looks cool, doesn't really look cool anymore in 10 years. It becomes dated because everyone starts doing it. And then there's, it turns into this thing that you start consuming over and over and over again. Sure. Becomes this pop song that you like for 2 years. You listen to it and it's great, and after 2 years you're like, okay, I don't want to do this anymore. I don't want to listen to it anymore. So I think that's where the discipline part of it is really important, to see architecture as a continuum. It's we talk about Vitruvius, we talk about Alberti, we talk about Louis Kahn, we talk about, you know, Venturi, we talk about 90s, Eisenman, whatever. And like to really get into that, to understand architecture as a whole and develop ideas is, I think, more important than technology. I think there's an over-fascination with technology these days. Yeah. We definitely need it. And I think for the students especially, I think it's very important that they learn BIM, for example, because that's how they're going to be operating in the next 10, 15 years. If they don't know BIM, then it's going to be like very difficult to, you know, exist in the architecture world in the very near future. So you have to know these things. But to say that I'm a good architect because I know BIM, I'm not so sure about that. It's something that you need to know, but I think you have to have things that you're enjoying to talk about as an architect, other than what the technology can do.
This is a very good comment. I mean, let's not be the, let's say, slaves of technology, or you know, but let's utilize them. I also teach for the third-year students. I teach detailing, and also some BIM included in that too. And there's this concept of timeless details. Like you have to focus on your work, where the end result, as you just said, after 10 years, you don't want to feel like, oh, why did I do that? You know, so you want to be proud of what you have done, even after 10 years, 20 years, 30 years. And this only can happen when you are using timeless features or things that age gracefully. So that's what you want to do. And in that regard, yeah, it's good. But of course, students, they should not forget that there is an evolution of technology, just like you said. We don't know what's coming up next. We might be seeing a lot more involvement of AI, artificial intelligence, or even now people are talking about quantum computing, which might make things even more different in the way that they are resolved, because we are limited by the computing resources that we have today. And if we come to a point where this is not an issue, the end results, because probably you're also experiencing that, you're focusing on space, and you also have to deal with these lights, you also have to deal with the thermal comfort, you have to deal with constructability. There are all kinds of different issues that you're testing back and forth, and it's really difficult, but because for each one there is computing involved, there is computing resources involved, and it takes time. I mean, it's not like you can do that forever. You have to somehow, you know, say that, well, it's satisfied, it's fine, let's stop here. But in some near future, maybe quantum computing might make things a lot different, and then you have to find yourself in a position where you make also you're relevant and you make sense, right?
And I think one thing about the new technologies, I mean, I've been reading about how software companies are trying to implement artificial intelligence into their software. Like the software makes you suggestions. Like, why don't you, you know, put the rooms here? And why don't you turn the building 15 degrees so that, you know, you make more use of the sunlight and things like that. And they propose floor plans, basically, and sections for the building, which I think makes the role of the architect even more crucial. Like, what do we do when computers can understand what architecture is to a certain extent, as much as they can, and start, you know, designing themselves, right? Then the question becomes, what is it that we do? Like, what does creativity mean in architecture? If you know, artificial intelligence can look at 100 years of architecture and can come up easily with, you know, a villa or you know, an office building, because you can, you know, if you look at enough examples, it wouldn't be very difficult for artificial intelligence to figure out how to make a building. So I think the role of the architect becomes even more evident when you look at it from that perspective, that you have to bring an idea to the table. You know, it's not about just like solutions. I think eventually solutionism will lose to artificial intelligence and computer software.
We got some questions from the students. Maybe you can see them. Can you see them at chat page? I don't want to read them.
Yeah, from Hamad.
There is one from Hamad. There is one from Elroy Gören.
Oh, okay. So there.
And two of them are at the chat window, and one of them are at the question and answer window. So
Q&A. Okay.
You want to read them? And
Hamad. Okay. I'll just open the question and answer part. From Hamad, relating to your experience learning Visual Basic for automating tasks in the office, considering how other industries are transforming and maybe how the world is transforming as a whole, do you foresee a future where architects have to have a grasp on programming and perhaps artificial intelligence? Yeah, I mean, we have to follow technology. It's I think, this has happened before in architecture. 40 years ago, we transitioned from hand drawing to, you know, computer-aided drafting, computer-aided design, and there was no option not to do it. You just had to do it. Like, you can't find a single architecture office today that does drawing, you know, by hand. The industry doesn't work like that anymore, and it's the same thing today. It just keeps on evolving. Now, you know, there's BIM. You have to learn that, and then there'll be something else. And you just have to keep up with it. So, you know, I think that's just the way it is.
We got some questions at the chat page too, if you
chat
can
page,
see. From Elroy first.
Okay, I'm trying to find Elroy here.
Can you see it?
Let me see.
At the chat window.
At the top, Kadir Çimen, to all panelists. Bazı arkadaşlara katılamamış.
No,
okay.
no, it's below there, yeah.
Edilecek. Elroy, okay, all right.
Yes.
Hocam, I have one question. Do you find yourself comfortable designing through computers, or do you create the original ideas using maybe hand drawings and then developing the ideas by software? Also, are there ways to design using software without losing the richness of experimentation of hand drawings? I think that's a very good question. And yeah, we in the office use hand sketches a lot. It's usually, this is my desk, by the way, in the office. I have a piece of paper in front of me, and I have my computer in front of me, and it's a constant back and forth. I always draw something by hand. You know, test ideas like print out a site plan or print out a section, draw over it. We use lots of tracing paper all the time. And then if we, let's say, draw a plan, we quickly jump into the computer, like start extruding it, trying to understand what it looks like in 3 dimensions. And when we, you know, have an idea about the massing of it, we quickly jump back into like paper and start drawing ideas about, you know, sections. So it's all mixed up. We use everything together. It's not just about computer or you know, hand drawing. It's not only about 3 dimensions either. Because when we say computers, we usually think about 3D modeling. But I believe that, you know, architecture just doesn't happen by 3D modeling. You have to have an idea about the plan of the building. It's an idea, you know. A plan is not just a 2-dimensional representation of a 3-dimensional object. It's an abstract idea of a building. The same goes for the section of the building. You have to have an idea about what the building wants to do in section. You don't, you know, just cut a 3D model and say, this is the section of the building. You design it. So, like, we do all of these things at the same time.
This is really good because it's great to hear that from you too, because I'm teaching computer-related topics to students, but I always tell them it's important to have your own sketches. You may not, I don't know if you agree, but one person may not like his or her own sketches. You may think that you are not skilled, but don't worry about it. Just keep on and you will have your own style. And believe it or not, people will like it. So it's important because it's the easiest way to transfer your thoughts onto something concrete. You know, it's much easier than pushing the on button on your computer and starting modeling with the software. And it just takes 2 seconds maybe to draw 2 lines, and they might be very important as a step in your design process, isn't it?
I think, I mean, I get this question from students a lot about the hand sketching part. I think that has partly to do with hand sketches are not as popular as before as representation tools. I mean, before, when you saw a project, you know, published in a magazine or, I don't know, online, whatever, there would be hand sketches. You know, that would be part of the presentation of the project, that, you know, people would present their projects using sketches. Nowadays, it's more about diagrams. I think it's a, let's say, a change of taste or fashion or like ideas, but that doesn't necessarily mean that architects don't make hand sketches anymore. It's, I think, still an important part of the design process. It's just that it's not as popular as it used to be as a form of presentation material.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So we also have another question from Hamad in the chat window.
Okay. Thank you so much for the insightful lecture. Thank you. My question is, do you feel that at the moment there's a big gap between architecture and construction practices, and how does it ultimately affect the way you design? Do you ever find yourself pulling back on the design as the timeline progresses? I think, yes, obviously, I mean, certain types of buildings can only be built by, you know, certain contractors. Like if you can't take any contractor and ask them to build a Frank Gehry building, right? Because it takes a certain expertise. But then, you know, there are only a few Frank Gehry buildings and only a few contractors that can build them. So I don't think it's an industry-wide problem. But that has to do with, I think, the budget of the project as well. You just can't design like whatever you want, you know. Complexity usually means big budgets. I mean, that goes for like very minimalist buildings as well. People usually think of Zumthor buildings as being, you know, normal buildings, but Zumthor buildings are very, very expensive buildings. And it's because of the way he uses materials and details them. So, you know, it's not just about the craziness or the complexity of the design. It could be many different reasons why you may not be able to realize a certain design. Do we find ourselves pulling back? Yeah, definitely. I mean, we use certain projects, like the last project I showed. It wouldn't be a cheap building, but we weren't really interested in like getting it built. We were more interested in the idea of it. So we just didn't think about whether it would be expensive or hard to build. We just designed it for the idea. But in real life, when we design a real building, we always, you know, keep the budget of the project in mind and who will be able to you know, build it, because you don't want to design something that the client can't afford. That would be besides the point.
Great. So I'm checking if we have any other questions. I think we don't have any other questions, and maybe Mrs. Neslihan would like to join us too, and we can conclude the lecture today.
Yes, so thank you all for being with us today this morning. Thank you all the students for listening to us. Thank you, Hocam, for having us in your lecture.
Thank you for offering, and thank you for coming. And we would love to host you in Ankara whenever it's available.
I'd love to come. You have a beautiful campus.
Yeah, we'd love to have you over once things are better. So hopefully we'd love to have you over as a physical, real lecture.
Love to, yeah.
So it's a promise. As soon as these strange days are over, we will meet in person.
Yes, please.
Yeah. So thank you again on behalf of Binat İletişim and VitrA. I thank you all, and to you as well, for this beautiful lecture. And yeah, have a very nice day and nice weekend.
You too.
Okay.
All right.
Take care.
Bye everyone.
Bye-bye.